Hello everyone and welcome to the Music Professor channel. I'm here with Loki and we will be talking today about something very exciting, and that is Gustav Holst's The Planet Suite. Part of the reason for this is that I love The Planet Suite, but it's also that I'm wearing a shirt that's been sent to me by Amadeus Apparel. And they're a company that specialise in musical t-shirts, and I think they're really pretty. And they've got a whole planets sequence, so every planet has its t-shirt. If you would like to get hold of a t-shirt like this, there's a link in the video description below. It's amadeusapparel.com/The Music Professor. If you click on that link, you should be entitled to a 10% discount. So that's exclusive to the Music Professor community. So wonderful community, there's a proper deal for you out there. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about Gustav Holst and why he wrote the planets, and why is it that this piece, really exclusively in his output, is well known? And why has it been such an inspiration, possibly more than any other 20th century piece, except perhaps The Rite of Spring, on film music? So all these things are very interesting questions. But perhaps what interests me the most is that Holst, who would really be a somewhat obscure British composer from the early 20th century, were it not for this piece, and there are probably lots of reasons for that, but let's try and tease through the origins of the work and why it's so marvellous. So the story begins in 1913, a very rich year in music history, because it was the year when The Rite of Spring was premiered, and also the year when Debussy's Jeux was premiered around the same time. Rite of Spring was a huge success. Jeux, no one noticed. That's a topic for another video. In 1913, Gustav Holst went on holiday with his friend Arnold Bax, also a marvellous British composer of that period. And they also took with them Clifford Bax, who was Arnold's brother, and also a friend and benefactor and composer called Balfour Gardner, who was, I think, some kind of great uncle to John Eliot Gardner, the famous British conductor. So while they were on holiday, they had this discussion about astrology. And Holst, being a somewhat obsessive kind of guy, I think, began to research the topic of astrology and got into reading horoscopes and researching horoscopes and became something of an expert on astrology and horoscopes. But I don't think we're talking about sort of Mystic Meg kind of stuff. I think we're talking about Holst developing a sort of almost an academic interest in the whole topic. And he described it as a process somewhat like childbirth, that it gradually germinated in his brain. And over the course of about 4 years, he composed the suite. He began writing it in 1914, and he finished it in 1917. It's kind of amazing to think that Mars, the bringer of war, and incidentally today's t-shirt is Mars, I think you can see it. And the music on the front of the t-shirt is the bit that goes... that wonderful passage in root position, parallel root position triads. And the fascinating thing is that Mars was apparently being written in the months leading up to the outbreak of the First World War. So that's one of those extraordinary prophetic moments in music, and there are a few of those. But this is one of the most spectacular, because Holst wasn't a composer particularly famous for writing abrasive and terrifying music, actually. If you look at his general output, that's not really the character of his music. But in this instance, he writes something cataclysmically violent and terrifying. And it's important to remember that in 1914, the great mechanistic form of warfare that emerged later on in the conflict was not something that someone like Gustav Holst would have known about or even imagined. You know, war to him would probably have been cavalry charges and sort of, you know, early 20th century stuff, not the horrors of the Western Front. So he couldn't have known that that was going to happen, and yet the music seems to tell us something, doesn't it? So Holst was busy writing the piece through the First World War, and the first performance took place in September 1918, so only 2 months before the end of the First World War. So although he started composing it before the outbreak of war, the first performance occurred at the other end of the First World War, just shortly before Armistice Day. And it was performed at the Queen's Hall in London to an invited audience. So you couldn't get a ticket if you're a normal member of the public. You had to be invited, and there were only 250 people in the hall when Adrian Boult first conducted it there in September 1918. Now, here's an interesting description by Holst's daughter, Imogen. She wrote of that premiere, "Even those listeners who'd studied the score for months were taken aback by the unexpected clamour of Mars. During Jupiter, the charwomen working in the corridors put down their scrubbing brushes and began to dance." Okay, so this is really live. This is the live impact of the planets for the first time. Extraordinary. In Saturn, the isolated listeners in the dark, half-empty hall felt themselves growing older at every bar. But it was the end of Neptune that was unforgettable, with its hidden chorus of women's voices growing fainter and fainter in the distance, until the imagination knew no difference between sound and silence. It's a wonderful poetic description by Imogen Holst, and that really is the effect of the end of the planets. I love the whole cycle, but perhaps the greatest thing of all in it, and we'll get onto this when I talk about Neptune in the future, is this astonishing ending, that the mystic chorus that sings at the very end, and the sound literally disappears into silence. And I'll tell you more about that when we get onto that piece, but it's an astonishing, unprecedented effect, and I can't think of many pieces written since that have the impact of that ending. But at the time, it was generally thought that the end of Neptune was a bit weird, and also involved having to have a women's chorus. And so a little tradition grew up in the 1920s that when the Planets Suite was performed, they missed out the last two movements, and they ended with Jupiter. So they ended with a jolly ending, and Holst apparently hated that. And apparently he particularly disliked the ending with Jupiter, because he said, in the real world, the end is not happy at all. Kind of a wonderful thing to say, actually. In other words, he felt it was inauthentic to end with Jupiter. It needed to end the way it ends, with the mystic chorus at the end sort of disappearing into the void. It seems after the premiere that a number of reviewers were hostile, so the Globe described the music as noisy and pretentious. The Sunday Times said that it was pompous, noisy and unalluring. And the Times said, a great disappointment, elaborately contrived and painful to hear. That's pretty harsh. The Saturday Review wrote that Holst evidently regarded the planets as objectionable nuisances that he would oust from our orbit if he could. But opinion rapidly altered. The Times the year after, in 1919, said, "The planets still leaves us gasping." And in November of that year, a critic in the Times said that this was the first music by an Englishman we've heard for some time which is neither conventional nor negligible. A very famous critic of that period called Ernest Newman said that Holst had one of the subtlest and most original minds of our time. It begins working at a musical problem where most other minds would leave off. There is this tendency, and you can kind of pick it up in the reviews, that Holst was seen as an intellectual. He was often viewed in those terms. He had this rather professorial demeanour. He worked as a teacher in St Paul's Girls' School in London, and he also taught at Morley College. So he was a rather distinguished academic kind of person who, as it so happens, had written this immense, rather sensuous, convulsive, epic work. And I think that fascinated commentators at that time. So for this video, we're going to talk about Mars a bit. I won't go into every detail. It's not the easiest piece to play on the piano, but we'll deal with the essence of the piece. It seems very likely that Holst was deeply influenced by a performance he heard of Schoenberg's 5 orchestral pieces, Opus 16, an immense and terrifying piece for full orchestra, and atonal, fully atonal really. And it was performed, I know it was performed at the Proms around this time and also at the Queen's Hall, and one of those performances Holst would have heard. And the Opus 9 orchestral pieces, like Schoenberg or not, if you listen to those pieces, they are absolutely astonishing. Profoundly inventive, imaginative, and in a way terrifying. A great explosive, expressionistic outpouring, visionary and fabulous, you know. I think it was Stravinsky who said that if Schoenberg had only written the Opus 16 pieces and Pierre Lunaire, you know, we'd still see him as one of the major figures of the century. And there's no question that Holst, having heard that piece, thought, I'm going to have a go at that. But the truth of the matter is that actually Mars isn't atonal and it doesn't resemble Schoenberg's idiom particularly. It's dissonant, possibly unprecedentedly dissonant for a British piece, but it's not as dissonant as Schoenberg, and it has plenty of triads and even conventional harmonic progressions in it. One thing that Holst does right at the start, though, and you don't get this in Schoenberg, is he has a 5/4 and a continuous ostinato rhythmic pattern all the way through the piece. So, and this is the marvellous thing which you get on Col Legno cellos and basses going da 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 dun dun da da dun da 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 dun dun da da da. The famous sound that you're used to hearing is the sound of the bows, the back of the bow, the wood of the bow, pinging on the strings, and it creates a kind of marvellously violent percussive effect, and also you can hear the pitch just coming through. Difficult to do on the piano, but I'll have a go. So we've got the 5/4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and that's the rhythm that's running all the way through. Thrilling opening, isn't it? Is there a more exciting opening in the history of orchestral music? It's marvellous. The opening ostinato, and then this terrifying motif of his. Why is it terrifying? It's like a very low fanfare with a rising fifth. Think back to the wonderful opening of Richard Strauss's Also sprach Zarathustra, which I think he'd written in the 1890s. I think it's a solo trumpet, isn't it? This business. Well, everyone knows this because of Stanley Kubrick with the major minor. Fantastic! What a dramatic thing that is. And then the timbres. Well, clearly some of these components find their way into this. Richard Strauss's piece was so famous and so admired, so I suspect that sort of thing is at the back of it. But Holst has the opening fifth right down at the bottom of the orchestra, and then he subverts that fifth by lowering it, flattening it, so that you have the tritone, the famous unstable interval, often called diabolus in musica because it's considered creepy and sinister. That coupled with the driving rhythm, and it's not a regular rhythm, it's this weird 5 rhythm, you know, it has an immense power, and this is why composers like John Williams have been so heavily influenced by this music. I mean, What would John Williams be were it not for the planets? Marvellous film composer though he is, he's hugely indebted to Holst. The phrase then builds up, so we have the tritone, then another fifth, then another semitone, another fifth, another semitone, another fifth, so it moves in sort of tritone shapes from G to D, and then D flat to A flat, and on it goes. And then at the top, very marvellous effect, we hear our first proper chord, major, D flat major chord, but against the tritone in the bass, the pedal in the bass. So then the second phrase builds up and it goes like this. Now that A chord with the G in the bass, of course, gives us a sort of quite a familiar tonal chord. That's A7, isn't it? Last inversion. So A with G in the bass. Does this wonderful rhythmic accelerando, which is quite hard to play on the piano, and I think I'll break off at that point. We get this wonderful antiphonal thing with the rhythm at the top of the orchestra kind of out of sync with the ostinato underneath. And the chord, I should say, that we've had there is B major against the G. So you've got this sort of polychord, I suppose. It's B major, but with a G at the bottom. So I'm not going to cover the whole piece because I think we've said enough to show you how the harmony and the rhythm coupled together form this marvellously intense thing. Harmonically, it's not especially complex, but he is doing something quite new for British music. If you think that Elgar would have represented something pretty progressive in 1914. This is going somewhere much more scary, harmonically and rhythmically. But I'll give you a few pointers in terms of the structure. So we get the cross-rhythmic stuff, and then it cadences. It's like a sort of cadence. D flat over C. So we've had G's so far in the bass. It's like a massive perfect cadence, actually. It goes to, we don't have that, but you get these bitonal effects with the G's in the bass, B at the top, and then C in the bass, D flat at the top. It's a great idea, actually. What a wonderful cadence that is. That's basically that. So that happens. The whole orchestra's thumping out these wonderful dynamic moment, and then he introduces a new theme in the trombones, which is on my t-shirt. That does its chromatic thing. That builds up to a third theme, which is this business, E flat minor, trumpets, and then G major trumpets, perfectly tonal actually, and then back to bitonality, back to G major, B flat major, and then A major 7. You see, this is not like Schoenberg, is it? It's almost like Elgar, 5/4 Elgar, almost like a pomp and circumstance march. And then we get this again a bit Elgarian. And here's this marvellous bit with the trumpet at the trumpet section. The top trumpet just behind the bottom trum. Do you see it getting up chromatically? And so on. And then it builds up to an immense climax with strings scurrying everywhere, and we get this business. Very badly played. And what is actually a sort of Wagnerian chord, but right down at the bottom of the orchestra. Very harsh. And often I think people imagine that that's the end because it's such a long chord. Then a sort of development section kicks off with the chromatic idea and a G-sharp pedal running through it. And eventually we do have this thrilling recap with the whole orchestra thumping out that tremendous octaves. I can't really remember any other piece that has such an electrifying moment at the recap. Great music, great music. There's a great climactic moment here, just at the end of the recap, where we get to this huge chord. Now, if we simplify that. This is actually very close to Gustav Mahler, a sort of a major chord with a Lydian fourth, a sort of appoggiatura. Yeah, that's the sort of thing you find a lot in Mahler, even Wagner. He puts the dominant at the bottom of it, so it's a more dissonant bass note. But nevertheless, it resolves to there. B major, this is the cadence we had at the beginning, that one. B over G to D flat over C. Well, it is very dissonant, but it's also kind of tonal. But interestingly, at the very end, there's a sort of wonderful scurrying effect that leads, I can't possibly play it, strings are shooting all over the place. And finally, they hit the same chord, that chord, but it's become a sort of Schoenbergian dissonance without resolution. That's unprecedented in British music at that time. And it just thumps out. It goes on and on. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, C. He finally does resolve it on an open C fifth. But wow, music of unprecedented violence. I keep using the word unprecedented, but it kind of is. And not only in Britain, no one was writing stuff like this. It isn't as dissonant. It doesn't have the free atonality of Schoenberg. It doesn't quite have the rhythmic sophistication of the Rite of Spring. But what it does have is it has its own kind of apparently simpler power. A combination of the relentless fives, a sort of version of sonata form, with all those sonata form components, development, recap, coda and so on, but they're really energized, electrified by this new sort of darkness, this vocabulary of clashing tonalities. It's really something. And it's funny, I don't know why the Planets is never taken particularly seriously in musicology, or why it's not thought of as an equivalent work to pieces like the Rite of Spring or Schoenberg's 5 orchestral pieces. Maybe someone out there might have a view on this. I don't really understand it. The orchestration is marvellous. You know, it's a vast orchestra, but Holst uses all the colours in a terribly imaginative way. And it has kind of the assurance of a film composer about it. And I wonder if that's part of the problem for the piece historically, is that because the vocabulary of this music was appropriated by the film industry and very much made into the vocabulary of film music, is that the reason why the Planets are not taken particularly seriously in musicology? I don't know. It's always an enduring classic as far as the public is concerned, and has always since the 1920s been a huge success among audiences. Let me know what you think about Holst's Planets. I'm planning to do more, so please let me know if you've enjoyed the video. In the meantime, please like and subscribe, press the little bell if you want notifications, and please consider donating to the channel. Thank you very much. Oh yes, and don't forget the t-shirt, because it's a great t-shirt this, and there are more, and you can go and have a look at Amadeus Apparel, and you can go and look at the Amadeus Apparel website, click on the link below, and get your 10% discount on the wonderful t-shirts that can be found there.